Today, we're diving into a force that has quietly but powerfully shaped Ireland's economy for generations: the sudden, unpredictable shock of global energy prices.
It's a question we've all probably asked, especially over the last couple of years. You see a headline about a crisis happening on the other side of the planet, and then a few months later, boom, your heating bill just goes through the roof. So, what's the connection? Well, for a small, open economy like Ireland, one that has to import most of its energy, this isn't some new phenomenon. Actually, it's a recurring story, a pattern of vulnerability that goes back about 80 years. And it all started with one thing. Okay, so let's rewind the clock. Our story really gets going just after the Second World War, as the world economy started getting tangled together by one absolutely crucial commodity: oil. The first real test? That came in 1956 with the Suez Crisis. When that vital canal was shut down, it threw a wrench in the works for oil shipping from the Middle East. Now, for Ireland, the hit wasn't catastrophic. We're talking slightly higher fuel costs, a little bit of inflation, but it was a massive wake-up call. It was the very first glimpse of a fundamental economic weakness. Ireland was exposed to events happening thousands of miles away. So, if the 50s was a little tremor, a warning sign, well, the 1970s was the big one. An absolute economic earthquake. This was the decade when that vulnerability we just talked about turned into a full-blown crisis that would define a generation.
It all kicks off in 1973. After the Yom Kippur War, OPEC countries hit the West with an oil embargo. The result was just staggering. Oil prices didn't just go up, they quadrupled, 4 times higher almost overnight. And the entire global economy just nosedived into a deep recession.
And what did that mean for people in Ireland? This number right here says it all. 20%. Inflation shot past 20%. I mean, just try to imagine the money in your bank account losing a fifth of its value in just 1 year. It was an absolutely brutal cost of living crisis that crushed people's incomes and hammered huge parts of the economy.
And just when Ireland was desperately trying to get back on its feet, a second gut punch landed in 1979. More turmoil in the Middle East. This time, the Iranian Revolution and the Iran-Iraq War squeezed the oil supply again. The result? Prices doubled, and the world was thrown right back into another recession.
For Ireland, you put those two shocks together, back to back, and it was just catastrophic. The country plunged into one of the bleakest, most difficult periods in its modern history. We're talking about sky-high unemployment, a national debt that just spiraled, and another wave of emigration. For many, the 1980s became the lost decade.
So you see the pattern here, right? It's crystal clear. What began as a little warning shot back in '56 exploded into a full-blown crisis in the '70s, with 2 devastating shocks that left deep, long-lasting scars on Irish society and the economy.
Okay, let's fast forward a bit. We're moving into a more modern Ireland, and as the economy itself transformed, its relationship with these energy shocks started to change too. They didn't vanish, but they began to play a very different role.
And this is where things get really fascinating, because the context changes everything. See, in 1990, a price spike from the Gulf War was just a little blip on the radar for the rising cultic tiger. But during the boom years of the 2000s, high oil prices were like pouring gasoline on the fire of the property bubble. Then in 2011, during the bailout, they just made a terrible situation even more painful. The shock wasn't the cause of the crisis anymore, it was an accelerant. And this quote just hits the nail on the head, right? The 2008 financial crash was the main event, no doubt about it. But the fact that energy prices were also soaring at the time just made the whole downturn deeper and so much more painful.
And that brings us right up to the very recent past, a period defined by a whole new kind of volatility, where energy prices didn't just spike, they also came crashing down.
We tend to think of an energy shock as a bad thing, right? But it's not always the case. Between 2014 and 2016, the U.S. shale boom created this huge glut of oil and prices just collapsed. Well, for Ireland, this was a massive positive shock. It pushed down inflation, left more money in people's pockets, and cut costs for businesses. It was a huge tailwind for the recovery.
But of course, that volatility pendulum swings both ways, and boy did it swing back hard in 2022. The war in Ukraine sparked another crisis, but this one was different. It wasn't about oil, it was a natural gas shock. And because Ireland depends so much on imported gas, the impact was immediate and pretty severe. Energy bills went through the roof, and inflation hit levels we hadn't seen in decades.
And yet, something was fundamentally different this time. Unlike the 1970s, the country didn't slide into a deep recession. Don't get me wrong, the pain for households was very, very real. But the modern Irish economy, with its massive multinational sector, acted like a giant shock absorber, and that helped keep the wider economy afloat.
So, after taking a trip through 8 decades of this economic roller coaster, what's the big takeaway? Well, a clear and very persistent pattern emerges.
So let's just pull this whole incredible story together one last time. We've seen how these shocks have changed their role over time, from being the main cause of a recession in the 70s to being an amplifier of booms and busts later on. We've even seen how a price collapse can be a good thing. But the one constant through it all is this. For 80 years, what happens in global energy markets has directly shaped Ireland's cost of living, its economy, and its future.
And that leaves us with the million-dollar question for the future, doesn't it? As the whole world shifts away from fossil fuels and towards renewables, does this give Ireland a once-in-a-generation chance to finally break this 80-year cycle of vulnerability? Can we harness our own wind and solar power to finally gain real energy independence? Well, that's the great challenge for the decades to come.